Hyperion in the news. December 21st, 1937. All of Hollywood turned out last night for the world premiere of Walt Disney's $1.5 million feature-length animated fairy tale, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Hollywood's landmark Carthay Circle Theater was transformed into a Disney-style wonderland. Crowds flocked to see Dwarfland, a miniature village populated with real dwarfs, and an animation exhibit set up outside the theater. Hollywood naysayers, convinced no audience would ever sit through a feature-length cartoon, had dubbed the film Disney's Folly. But after last night's premiere, Disney's Folly turned into Disney's Triumph, as the audience laughed and cheered and wept in sympathy with the film's memorable characters. More than 3 million drawings and paintings like these were created in the production of Snow White at Walt Disney's Hyperion studio in Silver Lake, California. The birthplace of Oswald the Rabbit, Mickey Mouse, the Silly Symphonies, and now Walt Disney's greatest achievement, the world's first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Hello, I'm Andrew Stanton, and I fell in love with animation watching the work of Walt Disney and his talented team of animators, many of whom began their careers right here at the Hyperion studio. And now you have the opportunity to explore this groundbreaking birthplace of modern animation. We've uncovered photos and rare audio recordings of the men and women who actually worked here. So welcome and enjoy your visit to the Hyperion studio and to the golden age of Walt Disney animation.
When the place was very small and growing, everybody had close personal contact with each other. There was so much laughing and clowning and noises of people horsing around there that I had an idea this was a real funny place to work because it didn't sound as though anybody was doing much work. And I couldn't figure out how a business could be run with people who would be just having that big a picnic. Walt was the kind of person who did not want you to just slavishly work. He wanted you to work creatively. He didn't care, in my own case, whether I sat in my chair 8 hours each day or if I roamed around the studio talking to my friends. The point was, did I get my work done and did I do it well? And that was how he judged all the rest of it. As a result, there was not a strict discipline. We were rather encouraged to go around and talk with each other and to contribute our ideas to what the other fellow was doing and to seek out his ideas in what we were doing. And this, of course, was the thing that made it such a thrilling. And this was the thing that knit us together into a tight brotherhood.
We were just like one big family. We could take time to play around a little bit, and everyone knew everyone else, and it was a real good feeling. When I went to work at the studio, Walt was just like one of the kids. After all, he was only 5 or 6 years older than I was. He was a lot of fun. He used to just get out on the lunch hour and play with the boys, play baseball. And one time when they were out playing, and Walt hit a foul ball, and Walt said it wasn't or something. And anyway, Johnny Cannon sat on the ball, and he and Walt were just going round and round and round like a couple of kids.
Walt called us up at 5 o'clock, and he gave us each 50 cents and told us to go have a good dinner. We had a very fine dinner at Applebaum's across the street for 35 cents to save the 15 cents.
Then Walt called us all back to the sound stage, and he went through the whole story of Snow White.
He acted out all the parts, all the story. It was probably 11:30 or midnight before we got out of there, and we didn't even know the time had passed. It was as if the fire had been built under all of us.
As the story work was nearing completion, the sequence would be delivered to the director to begin his work. His first task was to time each scene and visualize the choreography of the action.
Hi, I'm Ron Clements. Armed with the approved storyboards, a piano, a metronome, and a stopwatch, the director, composer, and layout artist sat together in the music room to work out the specific timings and stagings of every scene in a sequence, what action would occur on which specific beat of music, where the action would take place, and how much time each action required to be effectively animated. The room where this work was done was the director's domain, but it was called the music room because from the Silly Symphonies onward, music played a primary role in the visual choreography of Disney's animated shorts. Here, everything, action, dialogue, music, had to be broken down into units that would fit into the film formula of 24 frames per second and 16 frames per foot.
The director had to plan the whole picture, second by second, half second by half second. We had a meeting in Snow White, one of the sequences, and they had an action, like one of the dwarfs moving around the room. And he had to work to a certain length, 30 seconds for this particular action. The action, I couldn't see it getting done in that time. And Walt was a marvelous pantomimist, a marvelous actor. And I said, because we always deferred to Walt, I said, Walt, I can't do it in that time, or the animator can't do it in that time. And I said to him, Walt, do it once more for me, will you please? Oh, sure. And he didn't know it, but I had a stopwatch in my pocket, dirty trick. And he got all through and he says, there, you see, 30 seconds. And I looked at my watch, I said, that was 55 seconds, Walt. I learned a lesson. He had an eyebrow that went up and helped to part his hair. And it went up, and the other one went down. And he had a very distasteful frown, and he looked at me, and he just turned and went out of the room.
Walt had an intuitive, instinctive feeling for entertaining, and he had tremendous story ability. He'd come in, we'd have a storyboard, and we'd be a bit bogged down and not know where to go, and it was very annoying to show a storyboard to, because you'd start finding along, you'd look at him, he was down near the bottom, you know. And then by the time you got down, he'd say, well, we'll take that part out, and we'll develop this part, and we put this part up here, and then he'd go out, you know, and you'd say, why the devil didn't I think of that?
He didn't like to walk into any kind of embarrassing situation where maybe guys are throwing push pins at targets.
I was in Duffy Nash's office, and they were throwing push pins. And they learned a certain way to hold the push pin. They could rifle it toward the storyboard, and they used to get a stick somewhere, and they had a target on the storyboard. The door opened. In came Walt, and everybody quit. So what are you fellas doing? And he picked up a pin, and he had it all wrong. He had it just on the end, like that. It looked like it would end over and go right to bullseye. Right smack, they said, let that be a lesson. And they turned and walked out.
Each animator had his own style of animating, his own approach to a scene, his own style of drawing. There was a section of Snow White where they'd given some very important footage on the dwarfs to a lesser man, and it just killed me. I said, I'll come back nights and redo it. And one time Milt Cole did that with a section that he was so upset about, and he came back nights and weekends.
When I came to work there in 1934, Ferguson was the best animator in the studio. He was a self-taught person, came from New York, was a little older than the rest of us.
Norm could rough out something with just some balls for a head and some arms and things. And man, you saw that thing and it was rougher than anybody's stuff. But gee, it made statements all the way.
It didn't take very long after a dozen animators were on the picture before the strong designers came forth, and the strong ones were Freddie Moore. Freddie Moore, he wasn't necessarily a better draftsman than some of the others, but everything was cute, everything was fun.
All these guys were brilliant at comic characters, you know, but Ham was the only artist that Walt was sure could draw a girl.
I got put in with Ham Lusk, and they were paying bonuses to animators in those days.
And Ham got this idea that if he didn't have to make any of the corrections after Walt saw the picture, he could make more money that way. So he gave me the secretary's notes of what was to be fixed with his animation, and that's how I started doing all of his corrections, which he made a lot of money with, and but I was learning the business. And finally Christmas rolled around, and Ham Lusk presented me with a Christmas present, a set of golf clubs, and I hated that game.
Most of these guys were awfully young, and Walt himself was pretty young then too. They had a lot of fun. There were a great many gags pulled, and that sort of thing. Ted Thwaites would bring in a can of pineapple juice or something for lunch, and tomato juice. And these guys, they'd buy a can of sweet potatoes or something like that, and they'd switch labels on him, and he'd open a can of pineapple juice and be sweet potatoes or something, and he just couldn't get over it, It took him quite a while before he realized that he was being put upon.
They'd be playing pranks, like they'd rig a cup of water up on the top of the door so that when the guy came in, it tilted in and spilled on him,
Well, Milt was the type of a guy to pick on. He got an old can of sardines. He took a couple of them out, went over to Milt's desk, and lifted the board and put those 2 sardines right on his light bulb. Milt comes in, string on the light, 3 or 4 minutes, I guess, before the light got really hot. And all of a sudden, like a cartoon, the papers flew up and cuss. If I ever catch who did this, is going to get it.
We had open desks with our feet sticking out, and we often had what they called hot feet, where some guy would light a match and stick it on your sole very carefully, and it would burn and you'd get the hot foot, because when it reached your foot, it was tolerated, but they were like little kids in some ways.
They had another guy, he had a little pet turtle, and he got some special turtle food for it, and these guys would switch turtles on him. They began they began putting a little bit bigger turtle every week or every few days, and this thing was growing. And all of a sudden, they started reversing the process.
We had never done anything based on real people before. Walt wanted, see, the big word was believability. This picture is going to work. You're going to have to believe the characters. He wanted to stem, even though it's done by artists. He wanted this thing based on real people.
Hi, I'm John Musker. The greatest challenge facing Walt Disney and his animators on Snow White was the creation of believable human characters. To help them in achieving that goal, they developed a process of live-action reference filming, which became an indispensable tool in the analysis of human motion for animated films forever after. The resulting footage was then traced onto animation paper in a process called rotoscoping. But Walt and his artists soon discovered that merely tracing a human's actions did not necessarily result in a believable image on screen. Each animator developed his own way of utilizing the live-action reference footage to create the memorable characters in Snow White.
Tried to work out the characters not only as to appearance, but as to the way they would act. Different ones around the studio would get up and act things out with the storyboards, and ones who would strike Walt's fancy, he'd say, well, why don't you do what happens in a few of these scenes, and we'll take a picture of it. And it helped kind of establish the characters.
Ham Lusk was the overall director. But each animator would have, their own specific areas of interest, so that when we were doing a section that was assigned to one or the other of the animators, that they were always there. And we were doing a lot of rehearsals, and then they would tell me what they wanted.
I've always said that I am the only male actor in the history of Hollywood that played the greatest female heavy. They had this scaffolding built like a mountain, and I had to climb that thing at least 20 times. And it was very exhausting to get the action exactly the way they wanted it. I go into the men's toilet with this outfit on, and Walt Disney's brother, Roy, he came in, he says, "Hey, you belong next door." I mean, in the ladies' room.
I don't know any animator ever presented a scene to a director, I'm talking about Snow White now, that didn't have some corrections. And if Dirk couldn't find when Walt saw a sequence, he would find them, and all the things to be done over. So that's how good pictures are made. We wore the sweatbox out.
Hi, I'm Eric Goldberg. One of the secrets to Walt Disney's excellence in animation was a rigorous system of screening and approval for every element of an animated story, from story reels to rough animation to color tests to final product. In the early days of Hyperion, work in progress was screened in a closet-sized room with no windows or ventilation, with Walt and his animators gathered around a moviola, running the film backwards and forwards, studying and critiquing every frame. This room earned the name Sweatbox, because not only was it hot inside, but the animators would sweat nervously in anticipation of Walt's critique. As time went on, Disney built larger screening rooms for this purpose, but the name Sweatbox remained. Even to this day, we Sweatbox works in progress.
Walt used to sit in on all the sweat boxes. We'd be in there for hours. Dave Hand, who was the director, and Freddie Moore and myself and whoever was taking the notes. And Walt would go over every scene, say, trouble is the finger's too big there, Freddie. That's it, the finger's too big. Run it again. You look at it again, drive Fred more crazy. I know, Walt, the finger's too big. But he'd just keep running over every scene. You want everything to be perfect.
Dick Humor used to come out of Sweatbox mumbling, "These doggone directors, you do a nice job of animation, they want the thing changed. You go into Sweatbox with a bunch of animators and you can't win. You just can't win." Dick got to directing 2 pictures. When I heard Dick come out of Sweatbox and I heard his voice saying, "These lousy animators, you hand out a good scene to them and they turn in some other thing and then they don't want to fix it up."
I actually started working at the studio in February in 1930. Just a handful of girls and a handful of animators. And in fact, a lot of the animators were just on the other side of a partial partition. It was open underneath. Nights when the bosses were gone, we'd shoot ollie kits back and forth at each other and stuff. Just kids. After all, most of us were 19, 20. A lot of fun we used to have. There were no women in animation at that time. And they used to say that there never would be any women animators because the men couldn't be as free in the gag meetings. Women started out as painters. And after you learned that, then if you could ink, you went into inking. But inking was something you really had to learn to do. Now, learning to control the pen on the cells was hard to do, and Walt demanded shaded lines in his inking, which made it even harder. For instance, if you're going around a curve, part of it would be heavy and part of it would taper out to a thin line, and it was left pretty much to the inker's judgment. I suppose that's one of the things that made his cartoons better than others. Attention to those details. We just inked and inked and inked. And many's the time we used to ink straight around the clock.
So
on Snow White. You know, they got that cells, and she looked anemic. There's no color in her cheeks. And so they tried painting color on there, well, it looked like a clown. And one of the girls said, Walt, the girls couldn't we put a little rouge on their cheeks? And what do you mean? So she took out her handy note and a little rouge on there. Walt said, yeah, well, how are you going to get in the same place every day? And the girl said, well, of course we could. Very indignant. And every girl in the place backed her up and she said, gee. And they just knew where it ought to be. And here's this lovely little kid on there.
Inkers were inner sanctum.
Whoop, special.
They were so above the painters. They felt their position. It was a nunnery. We were not allowed over in the animation building. And the animators were not allowed to go down there with the nunnery with the gals. And the only man that came through us was the traffic ward. And he went so fast that all our papers would go flutter like this as he went past. I sat by the window. Here was the animation building. And the guys all came by. And I just looked up and I'd smile at all the guys if I was turning my work over. Wally Reitman and Roy Williams were right across from me. And they used to flash their mirrors at me to get my attention.
When the picture was finished, Walt came in with a painting cart piled high with these great big compacts.
Mirror with powder.
Enameled back and beautiful things. And gave each girl one, and the howl went up all the way down the thing.
They were
they looked in the mirror. Oh, how awful. They were so tired that when they opened that compact strap like that with the mirror and looked at themselves, they looked perfectly horrible. You can get pretty beat up at the end of a session of work at the pace at which we went.
The old mill was supposed to be a test of the multiplane to see if it worked. The multiplane camera itself had all kinds of bugs in it. It had to be worked out. By the time they got the bugs worked out on the multiplane camera, they had multiplane scenes for Snow White to shoot, and they got it busy on those first.
Getting toward the end of Snow White, they used to run 2 12-hour shifts. They had a standard camera and they had a multiplane, and so there would be 3 or 4 guys on the multiplane, at least 2 guys on the standard crane. The multiplane was over in one area and the standard crane was over here, and the room lights were turned out, and so you could run the two cranes side by side.
There was an operator for every level, changing cells or making the moves. In a number of instances, we would get halfway through in a very difficult scene and boom, one of the levels would lose one of its lights. And it could happen right in the middle of an exposure. A scene where we had been moving constantly from beginning to end, which would mean that the whole scene was wiped out. We have to go back and start all over again.
Firth Pierce was a young engineering genius who came from Caltech. When we opened up the multiplane, we were going to have a big show for Walt. We had $20,000 Copa lens. It's an inset lens and turned screw. And so Firth got up there with this lens, and we were setting this whole thing up to show how it was working. And I turned it, and it wasn't set. So all the planes are glass. It broke the lens. Firth wasn't there the next day.
One time when I was animating in effects, I couldn't figure out how camera was going to shoot a certain thing. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that if they had a little bar and there were calibrations on it and pegs, we could do this. And so I just went over to the machine shop, talked to the head guy there. He made it up. This is the one thing that the Disney studio had They trusted any guy there with an idea, and that made it fun working there.
When we first started, we had five sound effects fellas. All our parts were written. We didn't have a screen. We didn't have a projection. We'd have the picture, put it on the moviola, and work with that and write out every pattern, everything where something would land, everything that we figured would make a sound.
When I came to the studio, they had no sound effects department. And I said, well, I don't know anything about sound effects. But they saw that I had ratchets and all kinds of things. So I built every prop in the sound shop, hundreds and hundreds of them. I was working on a rain machine. It had the best sound for rain you ever heard. And while I was doing that, Walt came walking down the street. He said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I think this is going to sound like rain, Walt. He said, well, let me hear it. So I said, I'll be through this in about a week. He says, give me a call and I'll come down to sound stage. So he did. In his quiet way, he listened to it and said, yeah, all right, and left. About 2 weeks later, I had a call to go up to his office, and I thought, geez, what's going to happen? You know, the great man, I'm a kid, I'm in my 20s. And I got a raise, at $40 to $100 a week. Geez, I had more damn money than what to do with.
The echo coming out of the well, acoustically, that's a very difficult thing to get the way you want it. We tried every toilet and everything we could in the place. And somebody said, well, no girls around now, let's try the girls' toilet. We take that original motion and shoot it through a loudspeaker in the girls' toilet, pick it up with a microphone. It was very reverberant on there. That worked beautifully.
I always had the feeling that Walt ran that studio by the seat of his pants. Intuition. Intuitively, he knew what he liked.
If I had to work a little bit late, I would hear Walt handing around in the direction of me and maybe run a movie along, flip for a few drawings or something.
I always accused him of coming in at night and looking around seeing what was going on so he'd be ready for us the next day. He always told me, he says, couldn't figure out how I ever got any work done because my desk was always too clean.
We would gag and then we wouldn't like them ourselves, so we'd sprinkle them up some of the wastebaskets. Now, Walt would come in at night after we all went home, and he would go through those wastebaskets. The next morning we'd come in to work, and there'd be a bunch of wadded drawings. They straightened out, but they had wrinkles in them. Pinned up on the storyboard. Use this, it's a good gag.
Walt was a tremendously creative man, just full of terrific ideas. And when he got ideas, he visualized the whole thing 100%. He didn't get lost in details. He could see the whole forest and he could see each individual tree at the same time.
Walt was one of us. He wasn't the dictator, not at all. It was like we were all attuned to the same thing and we were all working for the one thing. This is why I loved the man so. I can remember nights when I worked a little bit overtime. He'd come in and pull up a chair, and we'd talk till about 11 o'clock, just his views on things. Animation, the character, the type of person that his character was. I mean, we believed that this character was a live person. And he had a way of instilling that in you. It was marvelous.
It was the most exciting, intoxicating time for all the artists, because that was the first. Everybody had so much enthusiasm. They worked overtime without pay. They were so excited. They were walking on air. They realized that with this Snow White, that Disney is taking them into another dimension. He has opened. all possibility, because when it comes to imagination, there is no limitation. And every time they could hardly wait for something, any sequence to be filmed so that they could watch it. They were never happier.